Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. I want to thank the USC School of Architecture, the USC Visions and Voices lecture series for bringing me here, and in particular, Professor Kelly Shannon for that lovely introduction and for being such a wonderful host. I met with incredible students of architecture and landscape architecture here today. Just had a wonderfully stimulating conversation about how the skills that students are learning here can be such an integral part of helping people to picture the next economy, the fair economy and the post-carbon economy. So I want to thank everybody who made tonight possible, including the Environmental Student Assembly who helped promote tonight's event. You just saw a trailer for the film. The film is very different from the book, I should say. As you know, one of the reasons why I like to start just by showing that little clip is because it's a reminder that though you guys are going to be listening to me talk for a while up here, I'm really talking about ideas that grow out of a movement, a global movement that is incredibly diverse, and I'm drawing on strength, intellect, of legions of people out there. So it's the limits of the genre that you're just going to be hearing me talk, and when you read my book, you'll be hearing my voice. What I love about the film is that the film is really a celebration of these movements that are on the front lines of resisting fossil fuel extraction and building the next economy. It's very different from the book, and I say that because I know there are some undergraduates here who've been assigned to read the book, and I know I'm just here to tell you that if you think you can watch the film and not read the book, you will fail. So I'm going to talk about the climate crisis, and some of you are thinking, that's silly, right? Our politicians fixed that for us in December in Paris at the big climate summit. Look at them cheering wildly for themselves. That's French President François Hollande and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Look at how happy they are, right? I'm Canadian, dual citizenship. This is my new prime minister, our hunky new prime minister. The New York Times says we're hip now. Look how sincere he is at the summit, right? Even our incredibly cynical media, always telling us what's impossible, they sure drank the Kool-Aid on Paris. Look at these headlines. Did you know that it brought the fossil fuel era to an end? I saw that headline in quite a few media outlets, even some I really respect. And I'm sure you've all noticed the gas stations closing in droves all over Los Angeles. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, Exxon came out with this report with projections about the oil and gas industry. They do these regularly, and they projected that by mid-century, in 2050, their share of the energy market would still be increasing, which is strange because if we are to take what our politicians said in Paris seriously, we would need to be off fossil fuels by mid-century. So Exxon doesn't think that's going to happen. So what happened in Paris? Is it this historic deal, this incredible diplomatic breakthrough, or is it an environmental disaster? And the truth is that it's both. What was negotiated in Paris was a diplomatic breakthrough, but the times in which we live are such that we have created such a big problem by procrastinating for so long and letting the problem get so much worse. Our politicians have been negotiating to lower emissions for 22 years now, and during that time emissions increased by 60%. And so because we've made the problem so much worse, we now need to do a lot very fast if we really are going to make a meaningful difference. And so you can simultaneously have something that is a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, more ambitious than anything anyone's ever done before, and it can still be not, catastrophically inadequate from an ecological perspective. So I want to unpack a little bit about what happened in Paris. Kelly quoted some of my articles, and I'm just going to pick that apart a little bit because I think there is a little bit of confusion about what did happen. I want to talk about what's good and what's bad. So, what was exciting in Paris is that our politicians set some pretty ambitious targets, some pretty ambitious goals for themselves. They committed to keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this was the big breakthrough, that they said 1.5 degrees Celsius, because we've increased temperatures by 1 degree so far Celsius. Sorry about the Celsius, but somebody once told me that a lot of Americans don't believe in climate change because they don't believe in Celsius. But it's all happening in Celsius. So 1.5 is a very big deal. It was hard won, led by island nations that are just above sea level, and their slogan was 1.5 to survive, because if we let temperatures increase by 2 degrees, they really don't have a shot of survival. It was also led by a block of African nations, and this is dating back to several years in 2009 in Copenhagen, when the U.S. and China led a push to define any dangerous warming as anything above 2 degrees. And when that happened, the African delegates walked out of the sessions that they were in and described it as a death sentence for Africa. So it is a big deal that we are saying collectively that these countries have a right to exist, and that matters. But here is the problem. So the way the way the UN works is they decided a few years ago, actually in the same Copenhagen summit, that when they set this goal of keeping temperatures below a certain amount, that they wouldn't tell governments how they would do it. So one way you could do this is, okay, so you set your goal, your temperature goal. That means that we have a kind of a fixed carbon budget. There's only so much carbon that can be burned in the world and still give us a good shot of staying below that target. And this is an accepted model. There's all kinds of climate modeling that sort of shows us what our carbon budget would be if we wanted to have a 50-50 chance, if we wanted to have, a better than 50% chance, then we have a different carbon budget, so we know what that is. But the carbon budget, so then we would carve up the budget, and we would say, okay, US, you've got this much, China, you've got this much, Australia, you've got this much, Bangladesh, you've got a little more because you've barely burned any carbon historically, things like that, right? So this was dismissed in Copenhagen as command and control. And so what was unveiled was this new model where governments would just go back to their home countries, do the best that they could, and then come back together with their nationally determined targets called INDCs, and fingers crossed, let's hope it all adds up to the goal that we have collectively set, how we have defined the dangerous. So the problem is, when all of the governments came to Paris with their nationally determined targets, when you add them all up, it doesn't add up to 2 degrees warming. It certainly doesn't add up to 1.5 degrees warming. It adds up to 3 to 4 degrees warming. And you just heard from Kelly that is incompatible with anything one would describe as organized civilization, which is a problem. And indeed, it is in the text of the Paris Accord that what governments say they're going to do and the goal they have set for themselves are not the same. And it notes this with concern in the text. This is very sort of UN language. We note with concern. So that's what we have out of that agreement. We have a pretty good definition of safety, keeping warming below 1.5, coupled with a concrete plan for disaster. The other thing that the Paris Accord says is that countries need to get their emissions to net zero by the second half of the century. But it says absolutely nothing about how they are going to accomplish this task of getting emissions to zero, okay? Specifically, it does not say that if we're going to do that, we need to keep the vast majority of proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground. In fact, more than that, it does not say fossil fuels anywhere in the Paris Agreement. And when we finally got this on the last day of the negotiations, the first thing I did was do a search, because we got it electronically, on the word oil. And the word oil does not appear anywhere in the document. And then I searched on coal, and the word coal does not appear anywhere in the document. And I tweeted this, and somebody responded, well, this is like if you you wrote an international agreement on the need to eliminate lung cancer, and you did not mention cigarettes. So this, I think, explains how we can be in this moment of dissonance where, your governor and High Prime Minister, go to these gatherings and present themselves as these climate leaders, and then go home and approve leases for fracking, and building new tar sands pipelines, as my Prime Minister is trying to do, because they are not confronting the necessity to keep proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground, and indeed they're not even saying the words. So the only proposal in the Paris Accord about how to bridge the gulf between the stated goals and the plans to reach those goals is that they're going to meet every 5 years, take stock, and hope that things have changed for the better. This is the plan. Like, who knows, right? Maybe Donald Trump will be willing to make deeper emission cuts than Obama, or Ted Cruz, or who knows. So it's actually even worse than that. Don't worry, it gets better. Because none of this is actually legally binding. So even though they have come with targets saying, okay, we're going to cut by X amount, and that might keep temperatures below 3 or 4 degrees, there's no penalty if governments refuse to do that. And many governments are on target to blow through that. And indeed that's what happened when the Kyoto Protocol was signed. So look, we've warmed the planet by, just 1 degree Celsius, maybe a little bit less. There's a debate about that. And this is what it looks like. This picture was taken 2 days after the Paris Accord was signed, December 13th. And if this were Los Angeles, it would be like, sure, yeah, a guy without a shirt in a Santa suit. But this is New York, and New York is not supposed to look like this in December. And people are supposed to wear jackets, or they used to. But our dirty little secret in the East is that we actually kind of like it when it's warm, right? That's why a lot of people move to LA. So it's really important to remember that warming looks different in different parts of the world, and the costs are very, very unevenly distributed within countries and between countries. 2015 was the hottest year on record. 2014 was the hottest year on record before that. There was a catastrophic heat wave in India and Pakistan this past summer, and thousands of people died from the heat. And this is a really disturbing photograph. Forgive me for sharing it with you, but this is a morgue in Karachi that ran out of space because they were dealing with such a very, very high death toll. So you can understand why not all of us were cheering the Paris Accord if this is what 1 degree warming looks like. We don't want to find out what 2 degrees looks like, what 3 degrees looks like, what 4 degrees looks like, or more. Why James Hansen, perhaps the most respected climate scientist in the world, described the deal like this. He said, it's a fraud, really, a fake. It's just worthless words. There is no action, just promises. So Kelly mentioned this demonstration that took place on the last day. And it was really significant. This is the Red Lines demonstration, and people unfurled these huge banners. That's the Arc de Triomphe you can see, in the background. And this was significant because, if you recall, this summit happened just a few weeks after the horrific terrorist attacks in Paris, and protests had been banned throughout the summit. because France was under a state of emergency. And, for a while, people followed that, and, there were some small demonstrations, but by the end of the summit, there was such a high level of frustration, and people were saying that, the climate is in a state of emergency as well, and we have to take to the streets. And so this was happening at the very, very last minute. Indeed, that morning, the French government said, okay, we're lifting the state of emergency, but just for this day, because they, wanted the image that people saw of the summit to be, the cheering politicians. They didn't want it to be, police and protesters confronting one another. So the demonstration, the Red Lines demonstration, went ahead. The mood in the streets was not one of despair. It was one really of clarity and determination. Clarity because, okay, our politicians have said what we should be doing. They've admitted they're not going to do it. And so it really is going to be up to other forces. It's going to be up to social movements to do what our politicians are not willing to do, which is stand up to the fossil fuel companies and hold them to their word. And that 1.5 target is a meaningful goal, even if they're not willing to do the things that are necessary to meet it. And as Bill McKibben put it that day, he said, they said 1.5, and we're going to damn well keep them to it. So these agreements, even when they are non-binding, can be powerful tools in the hands of a mobilized population. And we've seen that with the fossil fuel divestment movement, using the 2-degree temperature target to hold the fossil fuel companies to account for the fact that they have 5 times more carbon in their reserves than is compatible with that. It doesn't matter that it's not binding if people use that target in ways that have consequences. So for the next part of my talk, I want to focus a little bit on why it is that we find ourselves in this moment of such high contradiction, why there is this gap between what we hear from leaders about the urgency of the climate crisis, that it is an existential crisis for humanity. John Kerry has compared climate change to weapons of mass destruction, and yet we don't see the actions that are anywhere close to in line with that type of language. So why do we have this urgency gap? Are we selfish? Are we greedy? Are we short-sighted? Is this just something innate about humans that makes this inevitable? We sometimes hear that. Or is there something more systemic? Is it something about human systems that we humans have created and that we could change that is causing this? It's always a combination of factors. Humans are complicated. We are lots of things at once, and we have systems that bring out different parts of us. So, for me, my wake-up call on climate change, and, I'm not somebody who's spent my whole life focused on climate or even on the environment. I come out of economic justice, human rights, feminism, racial justice, and, I kind of thought climate change was like the one issue I didn't have to care about, that the environmentalists were dealing with it. My wake-up call came pretty much exactly 10 years ago when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. And I was in the city. I was writing my last book, The Shock Doctrine. And what is always really important to remember about Katrina is that this was not just about a really big hurricane, right? Katrina was a very powerful hurricane of the kind we're going to see more of as oceans continue to warm, right? When oceans warm, we get more intense storms, and Katrina was a very intense storm, Category 5. But by the time Katrina hit New Orleans, it had been downgraded to a tropical storm. It should never have broken the levees in New Orleans. Those levees should have held. And what we found out after was that there had been warning after warning after warning to fix those levees. So what turned that storm into a catastrophe in New Orleans was the combination of heavy weather, of the kind we're going to see more of because of climate change, slamming into a weak and neglected public sphere. And it was not just the infrastructure that did not hold in that moment. It was all levels of government. The city had no evacuation plan. They handed out DVDs telling people how to evacuate. That was their evacuation plan. FEMA could not find New Orleans, it seemed, for 5 days. And people were abandoned on their rooftops, holding signs that said help. I think we all saw many of these images when the 10-year anniversary happened in August. We were reminded of these harrowing images. And then they were abandoned in the Superdome, in the convention center, no food, no water. So you had weak infrastructure meets heavy weather, and on top of that, racism. And the way that played out is that the people who were the victims of this complete breakdown, this complete neglect, this complete carelessness. I always remember this interview with a housing rights activist who said, what we realized was we have no caretakers. There's nobody who is looking out for us. And then those people were called animals on Fox News. There were all kinds of crazy stories that have turned out not to be true about what happened in the Superdome. As people went to look for food wherever they could find it, they were called looters. And then there was a wave of vigilante violence, and I saw some of this when I was in New Orleans. Bodies on the street, people who had been shot by vigilantes who came in with guns and police. And we're still dealing with the legal repercussions of this. So that was not the end of it. I have to say, I believed at the time that this would be a wake-up call. And a lot of us did, because there was this moment, some of you remember that, when people witnessed this, what Paul Krugman has called the can't-do government, this complete inability to respond to this emergency. There were, even right-wing columnists like Jonah Goldberg were saying, when a disaster strikes, you kind of want big government to ride to the rescue. All these people who'd been deriding so-called big government for all of these years, made their careers on it, were suddenly going, where's the government, right? So they had this kind of ideological crisis, and people were saying, well, this is going to be like the collapse of the Berlin Wall for the right. But that's not what happened. What actually happened is, even though this disaster was caused in such a large part by the neglect, the systematic neglect of the public sphere, what ended up happening is that it was used as an opportunity to just finish the job. I still find this quote pretty shocking from Richard Baker. He was talking about the fact that the city was under evacuation. Public housing in New Orleans was empty, as the whole city was empty. Much of that housing sustained almost no flood damage, but people were out of the city, they couldn't defend their homes, and much of it was demolished. This is the kind of housing that replaced it, and as you can imagine, it's not the same people who moved out of public housing who moved into these condominiums and townhouses. The other opportunity that was seen was to rapidly privatize New Orleans' school system. New Orleans did have a failing school system, but just as the economic emergency in Detroit and all over Michigan has been used to just do away with democracy, appoint an emergency manager, and just do whatever you want, New Orleans was really the test case for this. Overnight, teachers were fired in the thousands, contracts were broken, and New Orleans now has the most privatized school system in the United States. 96% of the public schools have been converted into charter schools. Charity Hospital, which is the largest public hospital serving low-income people in New Orleans, is still closed. This picture was taken last year, and it was never reopened. This was my wake-up call because, this was the moment when I realized, well, of course we are not responding to climate change. If we're going to respond to climate change, we have to believe in the public sphere, and a public sphere that is under constant attack really isn't able to deal with a crisis like this. And indeed, the way our system works is that with each shock, whether it's an economic shock or whether it's a climate shock, we just go further down that route and become more unequal and more privatized. You know, Blackwater came into New Orleans in this period and was providing private policing. And we see this repeat over and over again. So this is not just about New Orleans, and it's not just about the Bush years. I want to give another example of what I would call the Shock Doctrine response to climate change. So, you know, you guys have really been on the front lines as far as the United States is concerned, you know, because of the drought, the multi-year drought that you guys have been experiencing. I think you thought that there was going to be more relief than has actually happened. LA is currently under wildfire warning. This is, you know, unbelievable for it to be happening in February. And, you know, the job of putting out fires are some of the most dangerous jobs in the economy. And, you know, firefighters really are our climate first responders. They are dealing with the impacts of climate change with their bodies, taking enormous risks, and often at tremendous cost. We've lost firefighters in recent firefighting seasons. Now, if you look at this truck, right, what do you see on the side of it, right? This is, you know, and I have to say, it's a little hard to shock me. Because I've, you know, I was in Baghdad after the invasion and New Orleans underwater, but finding out that 4,000 of California's 10,000 state firefighters working for CAL FIRE are actually prison inmates being paid around $2 a day, $1 to $2 an hour when they're actively fighting fires. That shocked me. You know, and you know, these programs are complicated. You know, California has incredibly overcrowded prisons, and these jobs actually pay better than most of the jobs that are offered to prison inmates. So they volunteer for them. But you know, the reason why it's happening is not because it's good for prison inmates. It's happening because it saves the state of California $1 billion a year, and it's happening in the context of the constant starving of the public sphere and the fact that it is incredibly hard to raise taxes in this state. So I think that it's, you know, I raise this because I think it is another example of the ways in which an economic system that does not recognize the importance of collective action, does not, you know, is constantly telling us that government is the problem, how that leaves us in a very, very vulnerable position when it comes to climate change. And it can easily become an opportunity not only to further attack the public sphere, but also to further erode labor rights. And the part of this that I find scariest is that the state of California has actually made the argument that it can't comply with court-ordered directives to release low-risk prisoners because of overcrowding in the prisons, because it will put their firefighting program at risk. So, you know, we're all often talking about intersectionality and how our movements need to come together, and I think this is a really good example of how the fight against mass incarceration, for racial justice, and climate action are really all interconnected on a very deep level. You know, climate scientists will often explain that climate change is an accelerant, right? So if you say, well, you know, was this drought caused by climate change or was this storm caused by climate change? They'll say, no, the storm would have happened, the drought would have happened, but, you know, climate change loaded the dice. It made it, you know, it made it worse. It made it more extreme. And, you know, what I think we're seeing here with what happened in New Orleans and, you know, what's happening with, you know, the inmate fighting program, and there are lots of other examples of it, is that climate change isn't just an accelerant for the weather, right? It's an accelerant, you know, for all kinds of other problems that a society is having. So if you already have a highly unequal society, if you already have a society where racism is running rampant, then you layer climate change on top of that and things go crazy. So it accelerates all of that. So, you know, coming back to this question of what is causing it, right? I think the best explanation for our collective failure to rise to this tremendous challenge is a case of epic bad timing. By which I mean that climate change landed on our collective laps at the worst possible moment when that could have happened. This is James Hansen, a young James Hansen, and this is an absolute turning point in the climate debate. It is 1988, and James Hansen is testifying before Congress that he now has a high degree of certainty that humans are causing the planet to warm. This was front page news around the world. This was the watershed moment. This is not when climate scientists figured out that climate change was real. This was the moment when we lost all plausible deniability. This is the point when this became an issue that everybody was talking about. And it became an issue that governments were now coming together to solve. So 1988, the same year that Hansen testified on Capitol Hill, was the first intergovernmental meeting on climate change. It was the year, 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the leading scientific organization that puts out reports and tells us what's happening with the planet, that was the year that it was formed. Okay, so 1988 is the year. We are going to solve this thing. We've got the scientists, the governments are coming together, we're going to negotiate a treaty. And just to give you a sense of just how much resolve there was and how front of mind it was at this moment, when the editors of Time magazine had to choose their man of the year for 1988, and it was still a man of the year in 1988, this is what they chose. They chose planet Earth, okay? So that was the feeling. But what else was going on in 1988 that might have stood in the way, that might have sapped some of that, good energy and resolve? Well, a year later, just a few months later, actually, this happened, which is the collapse of the Berlin Wall. 1988 was the year that Canada and the US signed the first free trade agreement that was eventually expanded into NAFTA and has become the prototype for all of these corporate free trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. So this was the height of the era when history was being declared over. And there was now a single way of running an economy, running a society that now, because the Berlin Wall had collapsed and communism was collapsing, would now be exported to every corner of the globe. That's what was going on. There is no alternative, Margaret Thatcher had famously said, and it's worth remembering the way Reagan
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
So the role of government in this vision was essentially to get out of the way of corporations so that they could maximize their profits, maximize economic growth, because when that happened, it would trickle down and create the maximum benefits for everybody else. That was the theory. And the primary tools of this new order were very clear. They were privatization of the public sphere, selling off energy systems, water systems, rail systems, airwaves, all of it. Deregulation of the corporate sphere, low corporate taxes to make it easier to do all of this, cutting all that so-called red tape and paying for these tax cuts with cuts to public services, all locked in under corporate-friendly trade deals. So what does this have to do with climate action? I think it has a whole lot to do with climate action. This set of policies, which in most parts of the world are called neoliberalism, or what used to be called the Washington Consensus, all of them conflict directly with what we need to do in the face of this crisis. Look, if we're going to take climate change seriously, we need massive investments in the public sphere. We need massive investments in the public sphere to deal with the heavy weather we've already locked in, and we know we have an infrastructure crisis in this country, so we need to make those types of investments, but that's only a very small part of it. We need to transform our infrastructure so that we can get off fossil fuels and meet the types of targets that I was talking about earlier. So that means, rail systems, public transit, energy, and I remind you that this was the era when we were selling all of that stuff off. So we lost a lot of control. And probably the best example of a rapid energy transition is Germany. Germany, they're now getting 30% of their electricity from renewables, much of it decentralized wind and solar. This has happened really, really rapidly, mostly over a decade and a half. But one of the things we rarely hear about Germany's energy transition is that a big reason why this has been able to happen so quickly is because in hundreds of cities and towns, people have taken back their energy grids from the private companies that took them over. It's called remunicipalization. In Germany, they just call it local power, or energy democracy, taking back their energy. And they did so because they found that the private companies were standing in the way, that they didn't think it was as profitable. So those are a few of the ways in which this clashes. Another one is just, this is expensive. We're talking about transforming how we move ourselves around. I mean, you guys live in a city that has struggled with transportation probably, more than any other, or almost any other. And you know how expensive it is, to build functioning public transit and rebuild and rethink how it is that we move ourselves around. And yet we're constantly told that we're broke, and we go in the opposite direction. We hike fares on public transit. So you have this conflict between the logic of endless austerity and the fact that we need to get money from somewhere, but we're told we can't tax. That's a dirty word in this period. So just saying no to fossil fuel companies became very, very difficult. It took Obama 4 years to finally say no to the Keystone XL pipeline. But when he finally did, TransCanada, the Canadian company that wanted to build that pipeline, announced that it was not taking no for an answer. And TransCanada has launched a challenge under the North American Free Trade Deal, and it is suing the U.S. government for $15 billion, saying it has a right to build that pipeline. And I have seen dozens of these trade challenges. I document many of them in my book. Some of them have happened since publication, including the fact that Germany is being challenged for its energy transition by some of these private energy companies that say, well, we have a right to burn coal and nuclear power, and you don't have a right to change the rules on us. So we have a conflict. This is why I called the book This Changes Everything, by the way, because once you start looking at this issue, it is not just about, a great new technology that we need to discover and then everything's fine. It unlocks all of these issues, including, obviously, the incredible power of fossil fuel companies and the banks that fund them over the political process. The Koch brothers are planning to spend $900 million in the next electoral cycle. That's more than either the Democrats or the Republicans. So my friends in the environmental movement, some of them, when I first published the book, a couple of them took me aside and said, Naomi, climate change was big enough. Did you have to make it about capitalism? And I have a few different, responses to this question. The first is like, well, was it working so well before we started talking about capitalism? Because if I was like disrupting a really, really successful movement that was actually succeeding in lowering emissions and getting all kinds of effective legislation passed, I maybe would be a little bit more worried. But we weren't making a lot of progress. But I think the more important issue, is, if this economic system that I'm calling capitalism, and I'm sure there are lots of economics students here who will tell me it's not real capitalism, and I agree it's not real capitalism, but I'm not talking about your textbooks, I'm talking about what we actually have. That, if the only problem with this system was that it was gradually causing the ocean to rise, then I would agree that this is not going to galvanize people against that system. But the fact is that that system is failing. I would argue the vast majority of people on this planet with or without climate change. And they know it, and they are getting engaged, and they're saying some pretty radical things with or without climate change. And what climate change says to us is we are on a deadline. We need to change this quickly. We need to get our emissions pointing in the right direction by the end of this decade. And it adds that layer of existential urgency on top of all of the reasons why people are motivated to say, we need to fix this system. So how else to explain that an avowed democratic socialist is making a credible run for US president right now? If people didn't realize that promise of trickle-down at the heart of the neoliberal project that said, yeah, just get out of the way, make it easier to accumulate profits. What does Bernie Sanders say day after day after day? It hasn't trickled down. It's stuck at the top, and people are experiencing this in their daily lives, and that's why it's resonating. How else to explain that there is a pope who sounds quite a bit like Bernie Sanders and is also being greeted as a rock star around the world? I did not expect that in, 2016, the rock stars would look like those two guys. So a whole lot of people are clearly ready for radical change to the governing economic system. And climate change, I believe, is the strongest argument we have ever had against that system, because the same policies that are harming so many individual lives and communities are in fact endangering life on Earth. Far from a distraction, connecting climate change with a critique of capitalism and corporate power is a chance to unite movements across sectors. The really good news, one little happy anti-capitalist in the back, little Bernie supporter. The good news is that even if our politicians aren't willing to stand up to fossil fuel companies very often, a whole lot of regular people are willing to do that and are filling that vacuum. In the book I call this blockadia. This is the blockadia section of the book, which is a phrase that comes out of the movement against the Keystone XL pipeline. This is an amazing grassroots phenomenon where everywhere that fossil fuel companies are pushing into new territory, we have them surrounded. These are the kayaktivists of Seattle who greeted Shell's Arctic drilling rig on its way up to Alaska. And I try to get into Shell's mindset, who are they hiring to advise them? You know where you should park? Portland, Like, haven't you watched Portlandia? They're not, they're rappelling down the bridge in Portland to block the icebreaker, right? A few months later, Shell announced that it was pulling out of the Arctic for the foreseeable future. And yeah, that deserves a little round of applause. Even in this stately room, I think we can do that. What you'll notice is that in every single one of these fights, women are at the forefront, and indigenous people are often playing key leadership roles. Here in California, fracking, particularly in the midst of drought, has become a frontline fight for many. Here at USC, you do not need to go very far to join Blockadia, if you should be so inclined. It is literally in your backyard. I spent the afternoon with an amazing group called Stand LA, standing together against neighborhood drilling. And this is, they are networking all of these communities that have drilling next to schools, right up against residential homes. And this is happening, 2 blocks from here. A 5-minute drive from here. I visited 2, drilling operations. One operated by Freeport McMoran, and another one operated by Alanco, which, because of community resistance, has been shut down temporarily. And I have to tell you, I heard absolutely chilling stories from people in that neighborhood, most of whom are Latino. Are living there because this is some of the only vaguely affordable housing in Los Angeles. Heard stories about kids whose nosebleeds were so bad that they woke up with their pillows soaking wet with blood, of very amazingly bright young women who are dealing with respiratory disorders that are going to be shaping their whole lives, in the same way that what we've learned about the poisoning of kids in Flint, are going to shape the lives of the kids today who have been poisoned. These are many of the same symptoms that led to people living in Porter Ranch to be relocated. But it was really striking that there's been no talk of relocation for people just a couple of blocks from here who have been dealing with these same symptoms: nausea, nosebleeds, asthma, heart palpitations, not for a few months, but for years, for many, many years. They have a very simple demand. They want to stop neighborhood drilling. They want a buffer zone, so that this kind of thing is impossible. And, California has gotten a lot of credit for its visionary climate policy. And, when you compare that with federal, almost complete inaction, California looks good. But look, I don't think it's possible for California to position itself as a climate leader while drilling leases are still being approved in neighborhoods in downtown Los Angeles. So if you're looking to join Blockadia, you do not need to go far. Not every one of these fights is going to end in victory, but many more of them are starting to end that way. Most notably the Keystone fight, finally. And this is happening for a variety of reasons. It's happening because of increased mobilization, increased networking of the kind that Stand LA represents, but it's also because in the past 20 months we have seen an unbelievable drop in the price of oil, right? From $150 a barrel to $30 a barrel, even lower than $30 at some point. So we know that we have been living in this era of extreme energy where the easy stuff is gone. And that's why fracking is happening everywhere. Tar sands in Canada, this is really, really hard stuff to get out. You basically have to boil the earth because it is semi-solid, right? And we've been making this argument that it comes at a much higher cost to water, to local ecology, and to energy, right? A barrel of tar sands crude, it requires 3 times more energy to extract that barrel of crude than it does to get a conventional barrel of crude, right? But the thing about unconventional energy is that it doesn't just come at a greater cost to the environment, it's also just a lot more costly. It's a lot more expensive. And this boom really didn't happen until prices started soaring. And so now that prices have collapsed, we're seeing gas companies declare bankruptcy. We're seeing a big contraction. 130,000 fossil fuel workers in the United States have lost their jobs. Tens of billions of tar sands projects have been put on ice. So there is this pincer of the increasing resistance and then the decreasing profitability that is causing a lot of investors to just go, I don't know if this is a good idea. And then layered on top of that is the divestment movement, the fossil fuel divestment movement, which has also spread with incredible speed. There's now $3.4 trillion globally that has committed to divest. And California has been leading the way on this as well. Two of your largest pension funds have committed to divest. It was a huge breakthrough for the movement when Stanford announced that they would be divesting from coal. The UC system has announced they will be divesting from coal and from tar sands. So there's been a lot of leadership, and I just point this out in case anybody is interested. So there's a lot happening, right? And some people say, well, what's the point of all of this? You're not, if you don't build that pipeline, or drill that well, somebody else will drill the well or build a pipeline. It's going to come out anyway. What does it matter? If USC divests, somebody else will buy those stocks. It won't make a difference. It's absolutely true that this is not how we are going to win project by project. It does not, it is not a substitute for policy. We need policy at the municipal level, the state level, the national level, and the international level. But what's actually happening is that because people are engaging in these local struggles that connect with their communities, with their schools, with their water systems that they feel so passionately about, it is building a kind of muscular climate movement that is winning policy victories. And you can point a straight line from those local struggles, fighting against fracking in a backyard or in one community, to statewide bans like New York State's incredible fracking ban that set such an important precedent because it said that it was a health risk, to nationwide fracking bans like in France and Germany. And Obama just announced, or a couple of months ago, announced a freeze on the issuing of any new coal leases on federal lands, which is major. And we need to extend that to no new leases of any fossil fuels, whether gas or oil or coal on federal lands. And that is, in fact, in Bernie Sanders' electoral platform. So what we're seeing is the movement demands making their way from the streets to policy, and certainly very much into this presidential race. The new demand has become, well, first of all, keep it in the ground. That's the old demand. But no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And the focus on infrastructure is really key because these projects are built to last. When you build a multi-billion-dollar pipeline or a multi-billion-dollar coal export terminal, or LNG export facility, when you look at the business plans, they're very clear. These are built to operate for 40 years. You don't sink that, if you plan to operate for a decade. But coming back to what I said earlier, we need to be off fossil fuels 40 years from now. So we can't be locking ourselves into these new infrastructure projects. So this has been the movement demand, but we're starting to see it taken up now by policymakers. The mayor of Portlandia, of course, announced that Portland will not build any new fossil fuel infrastructure. No transportation, no storage facilities, and no export facilities. And now that one city has done this, this is now the demand that is being made all over the Pacific Northwest. Seattle, Vancouver, all of the places that have been under big pressure to build new export facilities. But that's important for you guys to know because, as the Pacific Northwest says no, it's going to increase pressure on you guys to take that infrastructure. So get ready, and we need to do this together. So we're getting good at the no, not just the no in the streets, but also the no in the halls of power, translating that into policy. But no is not enough. It's not enough to build a movement with. People get tired of just saying no all the time, and the no comes at a cost. It comes at an economic cost. It causes pain. It causes job loss. So there's only so far you can go just saying no. There has to be a yes that excites people, a yes that people are willing to fight for. And that yes needs to, and I want to be very clear about this, that yes needs to not just be better than a future of climate catastrophe, okay? It needs to be better than the present. It needs to be better than a present of widening inequality, widening racial inequality, gender inequality. It needs to be better than a present where public infrastructure and services like school and healthcare are under constant attack. So how do we do this? How do we get to yes? I love this slogan. This comes from Movement Generation, food justice activist named Quentin Sankofa in Oakland. He said this at an event that we did together, and it's really stayed with me, and I always use it, and somebody turned it into this great graphic. Transition is inevitable, justice is not. There is going to be a transition. We are fighting over timelines right now with the fossil fuel companies trying to waste as much time as possible to eke out every last profitable quarter, but the transition will happen. We are, at the same time as we're seeing the price of oil collapse, we are also seeing the price of renewables collapse. We have, large-scale models like Germany to point to. So the conditions are very good, but it's important to remember that it is possible to do renewables in an extractive way. You can pay people making solar panels an abusive wage, and this is indeed happening. You can build solar projects on indigenous land and not share profits and not create local jobs. That's also happening. There are an unfortunate number of cases. You can do the same with organic farming. So how do we make sure that the transition to the post-carbon era is grounded in justice and that it solves multiple crises at once? And that's really the task. So I'll tell you first how you don't do it, okay? You don't do it by saying climate change is so big and so urgent and time is so short that it should trump everything else. Whatever issue you care about, it's not as important because there are no jobs on a dead planet, or, you know, we'll deal with your issue after we've saved the planet. That is how you piss people off, okay? Because it is absolutely right and natural to care about feeding your kids and care about not getting shot by the police more than you care about sea level rise. So the point is not to pay, my crisis is bigger than your crisis. The point is to show how they intersect and to build a coherent vision for how we can solve multiple problems at once, to define integrated solutions that radically bring down emissions while fighting inequality, while fighting austerity and bringing services to communities. That's why I always talk about Germany, because Germany is a great example. They've created 400,000 jobs in their energy transition. Their emissions are finally going down. It's taken a while, but they are. And as they have remunicipalized their energy, as they've taken control over their energy through energy democracy, through 900 new energy cooperatives, they're keeping the money from the energy generation in communities and using them to pay for services. So you have these triple wins around a starved public sphere, the need for jobs, and the need for emission reduction. So we need to look for these multiple wins wherever we can. So I want to share with you, just in closing, an experience that I've been fortunate to be a part of in my country, in Canada, where we decided to try to do this, to come together across sectors. We brought together people from the food justice movement, climate, migrant rights, Black Lives Matter, women's rights, faith groups, green tech, sharing economy, and we Canada doesn't have that many people in it, so we were able to lock ourselves in a room for 2 days, no speeches, just actually working it out. And we let ourselves do something that we almost never do, which is not come together to agree on what we're against, but actually come together to agree on what we want, to agree on our yes, to dream together. And it was some of the most, it was some of the most difficult meetings I've ever had. There definitely was conflict between Indigenous leaders, and we had the union representing the workers in the Alberta tar sands at this meeting, sitting, with the executive director of Greenpeace Canada. I mean, it was tense. It was intense. But there was a theme that came out of this meeting, and the theme was caring. Doesn't sound like much, but it was caring. That we have an economy that is based on taking as much as we possibly can, extracting from the earth and from one another's bodies, as if there is no limits to how much we can take. And what we need is a culture that is based on caretaking, taking care of the planet and taking care of one another and valuing that work. So we came up with a document, and it's not a list of demands. It's not just a list of things that we all want. It's a story about the next economy. And this document, we called it a manifesto. We launched it in the middle of an electoral campaign because we didn't feel like any of the politicians that were running were doing this. Were giving us a vision that was beyond, well, we're not as bad as the last government, right? And it's easy not to be as bad as our last government. You saw how cute our new prime minister is, right? So we came up with this document, and it's pretty radical, and I'm going to go through some of the demands. But what was amazing was how people responded. It was endorsed by 100 different groups, big sort of mainstream groups like Oxfam, very, very grassroots groups like No One Is Illegal and Black Lives Matter Toronto. And then we decided to go after the Canadian celebrities. And I know you're thinking, there are no Canadians, but there are, and we got them. There are 10. No, we have, we got quite a few of them, And we got Leonard Cohen and Ellen Page and people you would not believe signed this radical manifesto, like Rachel McAdams and Donald Sutherland. And we really wanted the arts community to be present here, because we were arguing that this is really a cultural shift. And it was really amazing. Jan Martel is a wonderful novelist. He wrote The Life of Pi. When I sent the manifesto to him, he said, yes, 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 we need to be shouting from the rooftops. And it just spoke to the fact that there is a hunger to say yes. So we sent this document out, and now people have done their versions of it, from Nunavut to Australia to the UK, and we didn't know what to call it. Okay, I had a really bad idea. And we wanted something that conveyed speed, because we know we're out of time. We know, it's Christiana Figueres, who's the head of the UN Convention on Climate Change. She says, where capital goes in the next 5 years will decide the kind of world that we will have. So we wanted something that conveyed that need for speed and that need for integrated solutions, that we can't just do this consecutively, that we need what's sometimes called punctuated transformation. So what we decided on was the LEAP Manifesto. And the reason, we debated this, we were a little worried that people would compare us to, the Great Leap Forward, and indeed our, right-wing media did compare us to Mao. But what sealed the deal was we realized that 2016, when we would be fighting for this, is a leap year. And in fact, Leap Day is coming at the end of the month, on February 29th. And then we started looking into leap years and leap days, and we realized, wow, this is kind of cool, right? Because we add a day to our calendar every 4 years in deference to the Earth's rotation around the sun. And this is a great metaphor because, we do this. It was Julius Caesar's idea, and then Pope Gregory refined it a little bit. We do this because it's actually easier to change human-created rules than it is to change the laws of nature. So this seemed to us a great metaphor for the fact that even though it is hard to change your economic system and your political system, it is actually harder to negotiate with physics and chemistry. So we like that metaphor. And I just want to sort of walk you through a couple of the demands. We were really inspired by Germany and energy democracy, but we wanted to go further. We wanted energy justice. We wanted energy reparations. And that's why it says that Indigenous people and others on the front lines of industrial activity should be first to receive public support for their clean energy projects. So, imagine if people who are on the front lines of environmental racism, like in Flint, Michigan, or a lot closer to home, were able to win not just an end to the poisoning, but were given the resources because it is right, because their bodies and their communities have borne the brunt of the toxicity of our current extractive economy. If they had the resources to own and control their own renewable energy projects, imagine as we shifted from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we also built a fairer and more just economy. Couple more examples. The trade deals, including the TPP. We also, migration has been a really big part of this, bringing together the migrant rights movement. And the manifesto acknowledges the role that our government has played in the wars and the trade deals and the climate disasters that are collectively driving so many people from their land. And because of that, calls for full rights for all workers, this isn't on this slide, regardless of immigration status, as well as an opening of borders to many more migrants and refugees. So this one, is actually, I actually think this one is personally my favorite because, we often hear about green jobs, but when you picture green job, you kind of always picture a guy in a hard hat putting up solar panels, and that's great. And we also call for big investments in, all of that good green stuff, transit, rail, energy efficiency, and we know we can create 6 to 8 times more jobs in those sectors than we get from the extractive sector. So we are calling for that, but we're also calling for a radical redefinition of what a green job is. Because we already have low-carbon workers, and we usually don't recognize that work as low-carbon work. It's overwhelmingly done by women, it's overwhelmingly done by people of color, and this is the job of caretaking, the job of caring for one another. And these are some of the worst paid jobs in our economy. We also recognize, other low-carbon work, the work of teaching, of arts, of media. I also wanted to just mention, with this in mind, that 900 USC workers at Keck Medical Center will be walking out on a 24-hour strike tomorrow, starting at 6 a.m. It's 24 hours. They're here tonight. They've got flyers. I'm going to have some of them at my signing table. I really urge you to learn about this. And I feel really, really passionately about this because healthcare workers have been some of the most powerful voices demanding climate action, connecting local health crises like asthma and other respiratory illnesses to the combustion of fossil fuels and, of course, to climate change, speaking out on the risks of fracking. It was absolutely game-changing when the nurses came out in support of saying no to the Keystone Pipeline. Healthcare workers support the climate fight, and we need to support them as they resist cuts to staffing levels and resist poverty-level wages, with many people earning less than $15 an hour. At schools, and I know I'm an outsider, but I have to say, at a school as well endowed as this one, all workers should be paid a living wage. Making sure that hospitals are clean and that patients are well fed is not menial work. It is some of the most important work in our society, and we need to act like this. So all of this costs money, and we've been told we don't have any, which is why the other thing we do is talk about how we're going to get it. The money is out there. And in a time of unprecedented private wealth, austerity is a manufactured crisis. It is at war with life on Earth. The money is out there, and we have to get at it. The principle is very simple, and that principle is polluter pays. It is enshrined in law already in this country. And there's, a really powerful example of this. I mentioned Porter Ranch, right? And I was out there yesterday talking, with people who have been impacted by this. They corrected me when I referred to it as a spill. It is not a spill. It is a blowout. It is still going on. It's been going on longer than the BP disaster. But something really significant has happened with this, which is that Governor Brown has not just ordered that SoCalGas should pay for the local environmental impacts and the local health impacts and the relocation costs for people in Porter Ranch. He's also said that they're responsible for the climate impacts of all of that methane going into our shared atmosphere. This is the first time a company has been held accountable for the climate impacts that it is imposing on the rest of us. And I think we need to take this precedent and we need to build on it, because there's something else that's going on right here in California, which is that your Attorney General, along with the Attorney General of New York, is investigating Exxon. And this is very much related to the polluter pays principle, okay? We've been learning more and more about this thanks to fantastic investigative work done partly by the LA Times and Inside Climate News. So what we now know is that dating back to the 70s, Exxon has been conducting cutting-edge research on the reality of climate change. Dating back to the 70s, remember Hansen testified on Capitol Hill in 1988. Between 1979, and this slide shows researchers aboard Exxon's Esso Atlantic supertanker. So this is an oil tanker. They're on that oil tanker. But between 1979 and 1982, the tanker was used to collect samples of CO2 and measure levels in the ocean and the air. Cutting-edge climate research, and it documented the increase. Based on this research, it published papers in peer-reviewed journals. It was well aware that climate change was happening. It was concerned, these documents have revealed, about the impact on its business model. Other documents show that it was also a little bit excited about the possibilities for drilling in the Arctic as Arctic ice melted. And yet, by the 1990s, the research had pretty much stopped, and Exxon started pouring money into groups engaged in denying the scientific reality of climate change and actively lobbying against attempts to respond to the climate crisis. So, in fact, Exxon and Mobil publicly mounted a full-court press to trash the science and derail the UN climate negotiations. And this included full-page ads in the New York Times. And if you look at those dates, 97, 96, the climate scientists in the room and the climate wonks will notice that these are the very years that the Kyoto Protocol are being negotiated and when it was ultimately decided that the US would not sign the Kyoto Protocol. So this reminds us that we are not all equally responsible, that there have been moments where we have tried to respond and there has been a campaign of sabotage. And we now know that the people who were most responsible for that sabotage knew it was happening, just as the tobacco companies knew that there was a link between smoking and cancer. And just as those tobacco companies eventually were forced to pay for the ads telling people not to smoke and for some of the health impacts of smoking, we now need to get much more of the profits from the fossil fuel companies to pay for the transition to make it just. Just means, yes, that the people who got the worst deal get a better deal in the transition, but it also means that the people who have earned billions and billions and billions in profits, Exxon earned almost $700 million in profits since it started investigating climate change in the 70s. Some of the people who got the best deal need to pay their share in this transition. So, so we called it the leap because we need to move fast. There is a chasm between where we are and where we need to go. We often hear, don't be radical. It's a step in the right direction. When you have to get across a chasm and you take a step in the right direction, it's not going to end well. We have gone so far off course and time is so short that now we have to go for it on all fronts. At this late hour, with so much to lose and with so much to gain, now is not the time for small steps. Now is the time for boldness. Now is the time to leap. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to blame my froggy voice on my visits to your various drilling sites over the last couple of days. I'm looking forward to hearing some questions. I think Kelly's going to help us. Yeah? All right, there's some students with mics in the audience. Awesome. As you leave, don't forget.
That was a very inspiring speech. I'm Phoenix from Revolution LA. I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the idea of a quote-unquote Green New Deal. I heard Jill Stein talk about that, putting massive resources and effort into overhauling the infrastructure through public works, and also what your thoughts might be on, or what your knowledge is on the idea of not only slowing down or stopping, but actually reversing pollution. Are there geoengineering technologies, things like that, to actually go back to being more pristine? Thank you.
All right, two good questions. I mean, I think Green New Deal is, definitely something you could call the sorts of big investments that I'm talking about, and I do think it is on that sort of scale. I think that we need to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the first New Deal, where a lot of women and African Americans were left out because it didn't cover domestic work and it didn't cover farm work, and there were all kinds of deals within that New Deal that went wrong. But yeah, I use that framing in the book. I also start the book quoting Angelica Navarro, who was Bolivia's former climate negotiator, talking about how we need a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. Because when we talk about a just transition, it isn't only about justice within a country like the United States. It's also about what the United States owes to a country like Bolivia, which has very low emissions. But as a country that is fed by glaciers for its water, in its major cities like La Paz and El Alto, the glaciers are melting. It's a crisis, and it's not a crisis that they are, responsible for in large part. So yeah, I like that framing. In terms of geoengineering technologies, I have to say they really worry me. And I have done a lot of research into it, and I have a chapter in the book on it. And what worries me is that the technologies that get talked about most are what's called solar radiation management, where we would basically try to dim the sun because it's apparently easier to do that than to put up solar panels. So you spray sulfur into the stratosphere to, essentially do what smog used to do in LA, right? So you're putting pollution, you're deliberately putting pollution up there so that it reflects this, part of the sun's rays get reflected back to space, and it turns the temperature down. But the Earth's not, an oven. You can't just like turn the thermostat. So it's unevenly distributed, just like climate change. And the really scary thing is that if you look at a lot of the models, what you see is that the big concern is that it would interfere with India and Africa's summer monsoons. So, anytime I see a technology that could be deployed in wealthy parts of the world with a very, uneven impact on some of the poorest parts of the world, it worries me that it could be deployed in a way that we double down on, precisely the injustice of climate change, where, it's a crisis that is so unevenly distributed. So I also just frankly, as somebody who's like covered the BP disaster, seen a lot of industrial accidents up close, I don't mean to offend any engineers in the audience, but like I'm not super psyched to put the whole planet's systems, in the hands of, fallible humans. So, Wendell Berry talks about how it's not that we can't take any risks, but our risks should, there is an acceptable scale to risk. And I think planetary scale risk is not acceptable, especially when there are technologies that are existing that would let us get to 100% renewables, for electricity in 2 decades, for our whole economy by mid-century. The research out of Stanford University by Mark Jacobson and his team is, amazing. So if we have the technologies that would let us do this, then why not do it? Now, your question was, how about, not just not making it worse, but how do we deal with, what we've already done? One technology that works really well is planting trees. I mean, we do need to draw down carbon, but I think that there are ways of doing it that are safer. So I'm on the board of 350.org, and our name is because 350 parts per million, according to James Hansen, is a relatively safe level of parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We're at 400, so that does mean that we do, it isn't enough just to not make things worse. We do have to, draw that carbon out. And, agriculture can also do that. I would encourage people to read Vandana Shiva's Soil, Not Oil, about how agroecological farming methods are a huge part of, of carbon capture, and it's low risk, and it has all kinds of benefits compared to, say, fertilizing the oceans, or spraying sulfur into the stratosphere.
Great. Just talking the thing? Okay, great. Hi, Naomi Klein. I'm a huge fan of your work. The Shock Doctrine was amazing. I'm a professor at Glendale Community College, and I'm also teaching the book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Klein. And reading that also brought up the tobacco industry and how they raised doubt, between the link between cigarettes and cancer. And this discussion of climate change also made me, sorry, I had a question, I wrote it down. It made me ask a question that while you were talking, I wanted to ask, what do you think it will take, or how long do you think it will take before we can, until we can depoliticize the subject of climate change? So we're not arguing about it, we're not debating about it, it can just be something we can clearly address.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. And that's, Naomi Klein's book, Merchants of Doubt. It's a brilliant book. I'd really encourage people to read it. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure we are going to get to the point where there's no debate. And I do think, frankly, it is getting better. I think that the climate deniers are getting a lot less time, in most media outlets, and obviously they still get time on Fox News and they still get time, on the Republican Party. But the New York Times has stopped quoting them, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? And it's also just people's lived experience, right? I mean, I think I'm not going to say that always, but for the foreseeable future, I think that we need to understand that climate change is extremely threatening to a cohort of people who believe in this extreme sort of what Joseph Stiglitz calls market fundamentalism, or believe that, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." If you believe that, you've got a big problem with climate change, because you definitely need collective action. This is the essence of a collective crisis. So, as you know, the argument I make in my book is the reason the right denies climate change, the reason the hard right denies climate change, is because if it's true, their whole project falls apart. And this is what I tried to lay out today. What I think the solution is, or a big part of the solution is, we need to engage in a battle of ideas. We can't just talk about the climate science. We need to talk about those ideas and how incompatible they are with what we need to do in the face of this crisis. And as I said, they're not just a problem when it comes to climate change. Another book I would tell people to read is Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, about the Koch brothers, and it's just a phenomenal book. It's so good, and it's not just about the Koch brothers. It is the history of how this radical vision came to dominate in the United States, and how it was exported through the think tank infrastructure and within academia, very, very deliberately. The right takes ideas seriously and set out to change the ideas and the values and the culture, and succeeded. Margaret Thatcher said, the tool is economics, but the goal is to change hearts and minds. I think one of the things we, suffer from, liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call it, is, we have a lot of people who are fighting on issues, but those big battles of ideas, they're certainly not funded, and we tend to stay away from it. We see it as too ideological, I don't think we win these big battles, these larger battles, unless we're willing to defend the collective, and have our own meta story, our big story. Charles Koch, when he announced he was going to be spending $900 million in the next electoral cycle, he said it was to hold back the march of collectivism. That is the Koch brothers' meta-narrative, okay? Everything they do, whether they're attacking Social Security or labor rights or climate legislation, it's all about asserting that when people get together and try to do things, bad things happen. But when you pursue your own individual self-interest, good things happen for everyone, okay? That's what it means to hold back the march of collectivism. So that's their story. But you got to hand it to them. They have a meta story. They have a meta narrative. They have a set of ideas that they have implanted in the culture. And I think that we need to get in there and have a battle of ideas. And the pendulum has swung very far in one direction, and I think it needs to swing back.
Hi, Naomi. Thank you so much for everything you shared with us and for engaging us in this dialogue. So my question is inspired by my friend who I'm here with tonight. She works as an organizer for a labor union. I work for an environmental nonprofit doing policy work. We met as organizers and activists, and we've sat in a jail cell together, and which was an interesting experience. But my question is, for people like us who are doing this work and are committed to doing it for our lives, and who work for professional progressive organizations, what do we do to always be pushing our organizations to be more radical, to integrate more radical philosophies and strategies into the work that we're doing to be better at building intersectionality, all of the things that you've talked about here? How do we make sure to hold progressive organizations accountable to these values and push them to always be better?
That's a great question. So what I do lately, I invoke the Pope. I, as a secular Jewish feminist, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro, all that stuff, all the caveats. I invoke the Pope because, if you look at Pope Francis, you see a guy in a hurry, And if you read the encyclical, it is an amazing document, which is really deeply about intersectionality. It is all about the connections between the treatment of refugees and the climate crisis. His meta-narrative is that we have a throwaway culture. We treat people like they're garbage, and we treat the planet like they're garbage, and we treat things like it's garbage. And we need to become a culture of cherishing, of caring for one another, right? And the other reason why I invoke the Pope is because you don't really want the Pope to be more radical than you, right? Like if I don't know what progressive organization you work for, but I would hope that your progressive organization sees itself as more progressive than the most ancient, hidebound secret society on earth. And if that ancient, hidebound secret society can change as quickly as Pope Francis is trying to change the Vatican, surely, the Natural Resources Defense Council can. I don't know where you work. I shouldn't pick on them. They're trying. I say it to my friend. I work at 350. I say the same thing to 350. But mostly I just say, don't be out-radicaled by the Pope. It's a bad look.
Hello, thanks for everything that you do. It's obviously very important. On the policy front, something I've noticed that everybody could do immediately to lower their carbon emissions, and almost nobody does. I'm an intermittent Lyft client, and I notice that almost every driver, they hit the gas between the red lights, sudden braking, around the corners fast. I don't think people are going to start doing this until the state of California and other jurisdictions pass legislation that will either heavily incent or preferably mandate all car insurers in the state and also all of the low-cost car insurance program the state operates for low-income drivers to offer and heavily promote so-called telematics-enabled, user-based, lower-cost car insurance for drivers who could demonstrate through their onboard computer. These devices are used now to a very limited extent. More fuel-efficient driving that also translates into safer driving, and noise abatement, less noisy driving. In other words, change the street environment by giving people an economic incentive to drive the way that everybody should, but almost nobody does. I'm fighting a lonely battle with my California legislators, and I can hardly get this idea considered, but I think it's one of the pieces of silver buckshot that could deliver a whole range of benefits if we just get done and get done sooner rather than another bunch of years. I've been working on this for years, can't get any traction.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
You have to say it would be great.
I have a quick question. Well, first of all, thank you again for everything. I was just curious what your opinion was on a lot of the critiques that nonprofits get, and obviously nonprofits have played a huge role in this entire movement. But there are certain critiques about nonprofits pulling aid in different directions, and you mentioned not sort of connecting as well as they should be. And I'm a huge advocate of sort of direct investment in communities, like you mentioned, and conditional transfer programs. These various programs to sort of help those communities most in need. And I was curious if you can kind of comment on nonprofits and maybe their role going forward.
It's a great question, huge question. So, I do think that there really is this problem of, as I was saying before, where, the right-wing foundations have had this strategy, ever since the Powell memo, of investing in ideas, of investing in a deliberate project to shift values and to connect, right? And, often people say, well, there's, the right has the Koch brothers, but the left has George Soros, or the left has, the Rockefeller Foundation, or the Ford Foundation. But they're not equivalent, because what you see with that foundation, obviously you can always point to, a couple of examples that, defy this. But, liberal foundations tend to fund, issues in silos, and to be very, very, very worried about anything that seems polarizing or ideological. And everything is sort of depoliticized within that funding framework. So I think there have to be different funding models. I don't think it's about trying to change the foundations. I think that there have to be different funding models, and the work is going to be done at the movement level. And I think people see that, and it's happening. The reason why I think that community energy, one of the reasons why it is really hopeful is because it is another funding model, right? And we have some really good examples where a foundation will fund a project, like there's some amazing projects bringing solar to indigenous communities, or, solar cooperatives in the shadow of the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California. The Our Power campaign, some of you may know the Our Power campaign. It highlights 6 climate justice community projects. They're very concrete examples of what a just transition would look like. So I think the real issue is, how do we get from sort of a showcase, okay, this is what we want, to policy, right? And we have to engage with policy. That's why the example I gave, we're saying we think that it should be federal money that goes to every indigenous community as reparations for the destruction to their land and the violation of treaty rights, right? I think this sort of, the foundation, it's a problem because it also lacks accountability, and I think it makes our movements less democratic. And so I hope that answers it a little bit.
I have a question about divestment. I read your book and I got really inspired, and so I joined a group called Fossil Free LA that are trying to get the city of Los Angeles to divest,
Great.
as well as SAG-AFTRA. I'm an actor and so I'm a member of SAG. So I'm wondering if there are people here who would like to divest their organizations, where can they go for materials to be able to bring to a board of directors of something to show that, one, it might be economically viable, as well as it being an obvious moral decision?
Yeah, so fossilfree.org. Thank you for your work. Fossilfree.org, and it was, I think 350 kicked it off, and anybody who wants to get involved in divestment will get all kinds of kits, all kinds of research. The good news, if you're joining divestment now, you're joining it after 3 years into this, and there's incredible examples to point to, and incredible resources to draw on. And the other thing is that this collapse in fuel prices means that we're now able to point to the fact that, if Harvard had listened to, I don't have the number at my fingertips right now, but they've broken it down, and if Harvard had listened to their students and faculty who've been demanding divestment for the past 3 years, they would have saved many millions of dollars, right? Because stock prices have collapsed. So when we started this, we couldn't make that argument, but we can make that argument now. We can make that moral argument, but also that financial argument.
Hi, my name is Yvette. I work for Pacoima Beautiful. It's an organization that deals with environmental justice here in LA, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm a huge fan. And thank you for speaking on race and injustice, which is, I think, the issue that the enviro movement, for whatever reason, doesn't really like to touch on, but it's real, and I appreciate that. So another question about kind of organizations and just the landscape for us doing our work out in the ground. How do we start taking bigger action on climate when, many orgs that focus on the environment don't really focus on environmental justice? And between our own organizations, we're like at a divide when we don't really see eye to eye on some things. Like, there's a lot of issues there. You mentioned the Porter Ranch, and, there's places like Exide, which are just a couple miles away, and then the Allen Coast stuff that's going on here. It just feels like we're so far from ever advancing in reaching justice when these things are blatant, like discrimination that's going on in our communities. So would you say that, we don't like to say that our problem is bigger than yours. That's not what
Yeah.
we want to say. We want to come together. We definitely work with a whole bunch of people, a lot of people in this room probably. But how do we move forward? I mean, that's just, to take action, because that's all, that's what we're working to do at a very local level, but we're thinking bigger picture as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's been shockingly slow, right? I mean, like these critiques of the green movement, date back to the 90s, right? And you look at how little progress has been made, and it's shameful. It really is shameful. I appreciate your words, but I work within the movement, and I'm not proud of how far we've come at all. So I think actually it's been really great the way frontline EJ communities in LA have been pointing out the double standards with Porter Ranch without saying, it's not that we begrudge you relocation, it's that we deserve it too. And I found, I spoke to people in Porter Ranch that, there was a real desire to build these alliances. And I think there's a really, really important opportunity here in terms of, this question of how do we move forward. So Governor Brown has said that SoCalGas is responsible for mitigating the climate impacts of this leak, and it's enormous, right? So what does that mean? And this is really, really important because, SoCal can say, well, we're planting a bunch of trees, I don't know where, but not even in the U.S., and, who knows how that's going to work out. We know there's a terrible track record of land grabbing for offsets. So I think it's really critical that the community come together in LA right now and define what mitigation means yourselves. Do not wait for your government or SoCalGas to define what mitigation is. You get in there together, and say, this is what mitigation would look like. This is, it would mean resources for all of these frontline communities to have energy democracy, to transition off fossil fuels so that we don't need gas storage and drilling in LA. And that would just be such an incredible precedent, And I think to have that, tangible, project right now, and my work, and I believe that these moments of crisis, they can either be moments like Katrina where things just go really, really bad, or they can be moments of transformation. And there's also a lot of precedents for disasters being catalysts for really progressive transformation. What catalyzed Germany's energy transition was the Fukushima disaster. It was a very strong anti-nuclear movement, saw what happened there, and they pushed really hard and got the Merkel government to accelerate the energy transition very, very quickly. So you have a massive disaster unfolding in this city. It is not just a disaster for Porter Ranch. It's not even just a disaster for LA. It's a planetary disaster, how much methane is pouring out of that, and still, right? And so maybe that could set a precedent. It's already a precedent. It's already a precedent happening that they're being held responsible for the climate impacts. But defining that, don't leave it to somebody else to define.
We have time for one more question. Hello. We have time for one more question.
I'm a founder of Tub Canyon Desert Conservancy, and we're looking at backcountry with small communities, often immigrant communities, and desert ecosystems being covered by utilities with huge solar arrays. And it's actually getting the support of some very large organizations and nonprofits and conservation organizations. As important as not defining mitigation, what mitigation is, I think it's very important to define what isn't green. Because companies like Sempra that own San Diego Gas and Electric are plastering these huge solar arrays and complexes out over the pristine desert, creating dust problems, sucking up water to wash the panels, and destroying huge swaths of ecosystem. And the problem is that the reason they're doing this is they're declaring it green power, and they're making money transporting energy. They do not make money out of local solar. And we're seeing here in California devastating legislation that's destroying the progress we've made on getting local generation that's more resource friendly and also actually more robust in case of any emergency like earthquake and so forth. So how do we keep corporations from masquerading as green and getting the kind of support that dress up the desert renewable energy projects are getting, or putting up the three eyes of Sauron on the edge of California and Nevada that fries birds at 800 degrees right in the middle of the California Desert Conservation Area? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And this is what I was saying, is it's possible to do renewables, in an extractive way. And, I think that the only way that you can prevent, these projects from painting themselves green is by really being out there and defining what it is, right, and modeling what it is. Because frankly, I think people are unclear on that. And so long as there's a lack of clarity, then, anybody can call themselves a climate solution. GMO seeds, climate-ready crops, all of this, Paris, during the climate summit, was just a festival of false solutions, right? That summit was sponsored by, nuclear power companies, coal companies, big agribusiness companies marketing GMOs, private water companies that see an opportunity in drought, frankly, right? So I see that there's a tremendous urgency, and that's why I wanted to talk to you guys about this experience we had in Canada, where we actually did get together and really map out what a just transition looks like, what it is and what it isn't, right? What the no is and what the yes is. Because I don't think we can really complain about greenwashing unless we're incredibly clear about what it is that we want, and working with great researchers like Mark Jacobson about how we can get there with existing technologies. We're here at a university. I met with a wonderful group of architecture students about how important their skill set is in working with communities to imagine what's possible. But we really need to get in there, because this doesn't stay static. I got into this not because I was starry-eyed about it, but because my fear is that climate change will be the ultimate example of the shock doctrine unless there is a counter strategy. And I've spent a lot of time showing how crises have been used by corporations to push their agenda, but there are lots of examples of crises being used by societies to deepen democracy and improve their economy. I mean, you mentioned the New Deal. That's probably the best example of it. But it doesn't happen without incredible levels of organization and vision, and indeed a utopian vision. Yeah, thanks, you guys.